Hi, this is Iko. I wanted to talk to you about an amazing project I've been working on, Broken Luck. What is Broken Luck? It's a zine filled with unique art by Perplexing Ruins. Yes, the very same Perplexing Ruins you're about to listen to in this podcast. Broken Luck is a beautiful 28 full-color page Troika zine module about demigods, tarot cards, curses, beasts, palaces, adventures and misadventures, and more. We've launched a Kickstarter to get the zine into print, and we need your support. You can find the Kickstarter at tinyurl.com/brokenluckzine, and I'll put the link in the show notes too. Please consider following the Kickstarter and sharing it with your friends, and every little counts. Thank you so much. And now, let's move on with the show.
The Midwest, for most of my life, represented the thing I tried to escape. But I end up always coming back for some strange reason. I would say most of my identity, at least creatively, and probably even just who I am as a person, is this clash between small, conservative, what I think of not terribly sophisticated Midwest, and Europe. And now it's me discovering the Midwest on my own terms now again.
Hello, salut, bonjour. Welcome to The Lost Bay, a show about indie RPG creators and artists and what's behind their creative processes. I'm Iko. Today, my guest is Perplexing Ruins, illustrator and writer. He has a unique art style in the scene that I can hardly describe. In his drawings, you can feel classical and mythological inspiration, but through an extremely personal and contemporary lens. His art has a strong, eerie, familiar, and at the same time uncanny touch. This episode might be a little different, maybe a little longer, and also a little more intimate, because Perplexing is a friend. He's one of the first members of our little indie RPG scene that I've met. But this was the first time we had the opportunity to talk for real, so I had a lot of things to ask. How did you start, drawing? Do you remember what were your first drawings, basically? Like, were you a kid or?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I started drawing very early. Like any kid, I think. That's the first form of real expression, right? I don't know. I must have been about 9 or so, 10. And I borrowed the Hoth scene from Star Wars and taped 5 sheets or 4 sheets of paper together and drew a panorama of the Hoth trenches and the laser cannons. But I made up my own like helmets and laser guns and stuff. And honestly, it was all in pencil, and I can picture it pretty vividly still. So I think that was the first time I made a picture that I felt like, wow, so that was obviously many, many years ago. But
What happened? I mean, in your drawing painting history, when did it become something like present in your life? I don't know, maybe a daily thing. Do you remember that or?
no, I think it was gradual. Sitting at a desk making things has always been in my life as far back as I can remember. I grew up in the Midwest, and my father did hand model building and stuff. So for years, we lived in a small house. My dad's workshop was in my room. So he wouldn't really build the kit. He would spend all his time cutting little pieces of brass and making these super minute, detailed cockpits for the aircraft. So I would just watch, and he'd sand and paint and cut and measure, and we'd just chit chat, and then in the daytime, my mom painted with Bob Ross on public television. And she would set up in the living room or wherever and turn the TV and paint. And it was this totally like homegrown, quaint, middle American art stuff. So nothing sophisticated or amazing or anything, but it was my exposure to handcrafts, and just making. And then when I would go back home to Germany. My grandfather, since the age of 14, had been a leather worker. So, I would sit there and help him cut leather and glue bits and, whatever.
Oh, wait, your grandfather was in Germany
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
and you spent time with him?
I used to return home every summer. So I've been to Europe about 17 or 18 times, I guess.
Oh, you call it home.
Yeah, I was born abroad. I do. I think of it as home.
Okay.
Perhaps less so now than I did earlier. Growing up is a major part of my identity. I preferred it to being here. So I started going back home about 8 years old, I guess, by myself. I flew back home alone and I would go every summer for 2 to 3 months.
So, drawing, painting has always been a part of Perplexing Ruin's life. But it's not until high school that artistic expression took a bigger place in his days.
A series of events happened in my personal life that made it nearly intolerable. And so, like a lot of people, discovered creativity as an outlet. I was a pretty big athlete at the time, but I devoted as much time to art and progressed from there. But I have always been socially struggled. So I actually sat out in the hallway by myself and drew a picture. And that was it. And then I had a teacher who basically changed my life.
What did he or she bring?
She treated art as a way of life versus just a class for a grade. Basically, she told us that it can be a part of your everyday thinking, and she encouraged everybody to start sketchbooks and stuff. And I think that translates to today. I post frequently, and it's almost like my art is a journal almost. And that goes back to her teaching, I guess. Instead of blogging, it's picture making, I guess.
Okay, so after high school, what happens?
I went to a small art school.
Where was that? Was it close to home or?
Same town,
Yeah.
yeah. Again, more of this kind of Midwest small family thing where you don't get out, you don't go far. It was a really small school. We were pretty low income people. It was affordable. I got a scholarship. It's a very typical common story. Quit being an athlete and embraced the creative life entirely, 100%. That's when I started really working hard on making pictures. I wasn't a great student, but I was pretty self motivated. So, like, I made pictures, I tried to sell them.
Oh, you tried to sell them while you were in art school. That's amazing.
Yeah, the very first painting I sold was actually at a museum show. I entered myself into a juried exhibition for a regional museum, and my painting got selected and then sold. So I actually drove my painting up to Michigan in the back of my tiny car and delivered it to the lady who bought my painting in the countryside of Michigan.
That's amazing. That's an amazing story. And what was it like, the painting?
I love that painting. It was a 3.5 by 4.5 foot painting on canvas. I got really obsessed with like painting ravens, but I drew them in this mythological. So they were like really big with long, skinny legs. And I would cake clay and dirt and stuff onto the canvas and paint over that with really watered down gesso. And yeah, that was it. And that's when I realized that it's a possible thing, and that happened.
So let's talk about how like RPGs come into your life.
Yeah.
You've always been a nerd, uh, but you were not playing RPGs, right? It's a more recent thing.
Totally. Yeah. So I grew up playing video games like a lot of my friends, Final Fantasy, and I played Magic the Gathering for quite a while. But I never accessed D&D. And then art school happened, and I became one of these very, you know, for lack of a better word, one of these elite, sophisticated type peoples, and it was all about fine art and good film and good music. That's a trap a lot of people fall into. And then I got lost for a couple years. And then after a series of events and the pandemic then hit, I remember sitting around one day and just deciding I've never played D&D and I'm curious, what is this? I don't know. I was looking for something and I just started looking it up. And then I became instantly like terrified because like, oh, I have to be around people and that's something I can't do very well. And so I started looking up how to play by yourself, D&D. And I came across a whole bunch of Reddit posts that basically said that's impossible, it's stupid, you cannot do that. And before I got too discouraged, though, I discovered Martin Knight's game, D100 Dungeon, and it blew me away. I was like, oh my God, this is like an RPG for one player. I kind of got into that for a while. And then I got really into like print and play board games for a while, card games. And my mind was blown. Like, I had just accessed this total awesome mine of creative, awesome output that I hadn't accessed before. And I couldn't stop. I was just downloading files and printing out weird stuff and playing and researching. And I remember sitting down to play D100 Dungeon by myself, and it felt very odd. Here I am, like dice and by myself. And it was just this very bizarre situation. I felt very out of place for a while, but I gradually found some solace in that solitary play. And then I discovered what I guess we all call the OSR, just through more Googling and Reddit searching. And I could not believe the creativity I was seeing.
Yeah, and from a player to an artist of the scene, like what happened? Did you start drawing for yourself when you were playing, solo RPGs, or did something clicked at some point? And
I'm still analyzing that myself a little bit. I had been unemployed, so it's like, I'm going to paint again. I'm going to paint again. And I made a series of felt paintings on canvas. And I deliberately went away from an old style I'd worked in, which is very photographic based, very historical based, to like these outrageous creatures in a post-apocalyptic wasteland with like bright reds. I hadn't used red in about 10 years. And now I was painting these bright, luminescent red canvases with purple figures and masked helmet people, and nobody liked them. And one day I went out on the street and I put every canvas on the sidewalk with a big free sign. I even walked down the street and said free paintings. And after 5 hours or whatever, nobody even like took one painting. I was like, fuck it, this sucks. And then we moved cross country again. And when we relocated, I pulled out paper. And for the first time in many years, I was like, I'm going to work small. And I drew these little figures with gouache on paper that were like nothing I'd ever painted before. And I was like, I'm going to put one of these on Reddit. And somebody's like, oh man, these are great. And truth be told, I feel like you were one of the first people that appreciated some of those early little characters on Reddit. And people were like, these are really cool. And that was the first positive feedback I'd received in quite a few years. So I got really excited, and I haven't stopped drawing since then, basically.
yeah, when I saw those pieces, I was really struck. I don't know. There's something in those pieces that brings me back to childhood, like to not to my childhood, but to some like imaginary childhood. I don't know.
I feel somewhat the same way about those pieces. I had just come from an extremely vulnerable situation, and I had come from a creative place of making very serious, heady artwork,
Okay.
conceptual paintings and blah, blah, blah. And then I just decided to access what was this dream world, a vulnerable dream world, I guess. And that's what some of those early paintings were. Like there's a knight, I called him the Frond Knight, and it was kind of sloppy, gouache with bright yellow, and I hadn't used yellow in years. And there was just like this exuberance, I think, and this naivety to them. I was purely drawing. And maybe that's what you're talking about, like this.
Yeah, you're putting the right words on that. Yes, there's an exuberance, a playfulness in those drawings, and there's also, you're right, vulnerability. Yeah. Did your technique evolve since you started doing art for the OSR scene?
I started making those little gouache paintings. I used gouache for a long time, but then I started stripping the color out and just going with black. Black gouache has this jeweled, beautiful, just rich black on the paper. And I love it. It's so fun to use, but it's also really tedious to use sometimes. and it doesn't handle wear overly well because it becomes like velvet, so it gets scuffed. And it's hard to paint over because it's a water activated medium, so layering can be tough. And then I started seeing more of the scene. I just wanted to experiment more, you know? So I started adopting some more ink. I love drawing rocks and mountains and stuff like that. And so microns obviously lend themselves to that really, really well because you can just vary your line quality. I move a lot, I bounce a lot, I shake my feet a lot, things like that. And drawing those, I can't stop. I'll just keep drawing and drawing and drawing and drawing. And it's almost become a way of channeling that energy, that restless energy I have. And I love making line like that. And then I discovered dip pens with nibs, and I'd never tried that before. So I grabbed some of those. I love dipping a steel nib into the ink, and I overwork it still. I'll gouge paper and I push too hard, but I really love that organic quality of the dip pen and the messes you get and the mistakes. And I'm just not very precise because I'm improvising a lot of it. I see some people draw like a full blown pencil drawing with shading and then ink it. And I'll draw like 7 shapes and some blocks of shadow, and then I'll go into the pen and just draw. And that works for me. And then, yeah, lately I discovered digital. And it's really fun, though. I've already begun to wear out my new Wacom tablet because I push so hard when I draw.
But it's like, I guess it's super new, right? I mean,
I've been drawing with a digital pen for about 2.5 weeks, I guess.
what is Midwest, because I feel like it's important, even like as a, I might be wrong, tell me, like an inspirational source for some of your work.
As I approach 40 years old, I think a lot about this. But I would say the Midwest, for most of my life, represented the thing I tried to escape. Moved around a lot. I've bounced around a lot, but I end up always coming back for some strange reason. Magnetism. I always thought of Europe as my home, my birthplace. And yet, oddly, the Midwest is obviously my home. I keep coming back, even when I don't want to. I fight it tooth and nail, and yet there I am again, and there's something about that. There's a magnetism. It's like anywhere. I don't know if you grew up in Italy or Europe. I'm not sure. Italy.
Well, it's a mess. I've been moving
Oh,
places a lot. I was born in Italy from a French Italian family. I spent there a few years. Then I grew up in Corsica, which is a French island, but with a very strong, somehow Italian culture. Then my family moved back to Italy. I was a young adult, and there I started moving around, not going very far, like England, France, Italy, Corsica,
yeah.
like spinning around into this small area. And I'm still somehow doing that.
We're very similar in that way, I
Yeah,
think. I
yeah,
mean, the United States is huge, so my wheel is perhaps bigger.
yeah,
But
yeah, of course.
but yeah, it's that placelessness. It sounds like you have a lot of that too. But the Midwest to me is my father telling me stories about growing up here. I would say most of my identity, at least creatively, and probably even just who I am as a person, is this clash between small, conservative, what I think of not terribly sophisticated Midwest and Europe. Like growing up and walking on 500-year stone walls and peering in towers and going to forests and seeing old churches, castles. My grandparents took me to castles all the time. That was my favorite field trip. So I always loved the ruinous ones, but yes, I've been to the Neuschwanstein Castle. I've been to palaces. I've been to actual war castles that were ruined, stuff like that. And then coming back to here and being totally deflated by it and hating it and being bored all the time. And then my grandfather passed a few years ago, and it was a very physical reaction. And I almost severed my tie to Europe entirely. And now, post that situation, it's me discovering the Midwest on my own terms now again. Forests, hills. Where I'm at is basically where the glaciers stopped moving and pushing Earth. So there's like a really rocky, hilly area where I'm at. Super fertile, lots of forests. It's haunted. I think of it as very much haunted. Interactions with First Nations peoples were very intense and sad here. I think of it as being laden with Mothman and Bigfoot lore, even though this isn't the dominant area for that. I just have that in my mind. Stuff like that. I'm discovering it on my own terms.
You probably got it. Perplexing Ruins is a prolific artist with a lot of hunger for new art, new shapes, new techniques. And by the way, he has a Patreon where he shares lots of drawing free to use, even for commercial projects. I'll put a link to his Patreon in the show notes. But Perplexing is also a writer. On his itch.io page, you can find several games and modules, and among those, there is Darkness Moves. It's an adventure module for Cairn. It takes place in a little village named Argol, hit by continuous rain and a curse. In just a moment, you'll hear Perplexing talking about Darkness Moves. In this last bit, we experienced little connection problems, so a Perplexing voice might sound a bit far.
So, Darkness Moves was written over a long time. I actually took quite a break before doing the final push to publication. So it started off, I had read a book called Cairn, which many listeners will probably know, by the author Yochai Gao, which was a forest fantasy game system that I really liked. I really responded to its setting, or implied setting at least, and its aesthetic. So I wanted to write something for it to challenge myself to try and, it was going to be 16 pages, I think. And I had did a bunch of paper and folded them in half as the zine would have been at 16 pages. Page one, and manually wrote page one, this is what will be here, this will what will be here. So when I went into the computer, I could lay it out that way. And then I shelved it for a long time. I just got frustrated. I didn't think I had the skills or experience to write an adventure.
After shelving the project for some time, Perplexing Ruins buys a new publishing application that makes his workflow much more fluid and gets him back to work on the zine. So I was wondering, what was the entry point, for you in the world of Darkness Moves?
Growing up, I'd returned to Germany often, and there were towers in the city I lived. And I had been always told one of these towers was a witch's tower. And these were common things in Europe, in Germany at least, as far as I understand, where they would lock people in these towers to await, their punishments or whatever. Somewhere along the line, I don't know if I was told this or I imagined this, but I had this idea that they would toss these witches from these towers down to the cobblestones or the earth below. And I've been haunted by that notion for about 15 years. I don't know. I've just been like, and I guess Darkness Moves was my attempt to manifest that. And then I tried to expand it from there, why the land became haunted and why the legacy that leaves in the village, superstitions and things like that. So I wrote the book. I published it as a PDF, which went through a bit of a rocky start. And that was just me lacking some experience. And I made a few flubs on how I launched it, but it got settled. And then I was contacted by a really awesome member of our little community, LFOSR, who offered to do a launch for it. Sort of issuing these limited edition handcrafted editions of it to kind of experiment with launching their enterprise as a new small distributor of handcrafted nice editions of small books. It was really kind and generous to create this edition for me. And so I added some extra content in there. There's like a little treasure card that comes with it for the limited edition. And that's sort of concluded Darkness Moves, and now kind of looking to maybe do a little bit of a wider, less limited release of the book too.
That was Perplexing Ruins, illustrator and writer. He is working on a lot of projects. There's Broken Lock, the Troika zine I'm kickstarting. It's filled with old and also newer illustrations by Perplexing. There is also a new game book called Fallen. It's a classless D6 game. Perplexing has released the core rules on his itch.io page. And he's also working for a Morkborg-themed card game called Brazen Crown. He's doing 100 illustrations for it. He has shared some of them on Twitter and they look amazing. The Lost Bay is a podcast about indie RPG creators and artists and what's behind their creative processes. It's produced by me, Iko, and music is by Every Eyes. If you want to get in touch or get news about the podcast, you can find me on Twitter at The Lost Bay. Thank you so much for listening and salut, à bientôt.